So I'm in Peterborough, Ontario, Canada, which is the traditional territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe, and I teach history, environmental studies, and media studies at Trent University. I want to go ahead and share my screen so that we can um, look at these images together. This will be a very heavily illustrated talk today, including a couple clips from a recently digitized slideshow that's really central to the story I tell in the book. So I want to begin by describing, first of all, how I got interested in this topic of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and then share with you what was really a journey to research and write this book. And I'll go ahead and say from the outset, this is not the book I set out to write. This emerged from years of research in libraries and archives, but also from listening and learning, from talking with Indigenous leaders and scientists and environmental activists, and many others across the continent who have cared about and fought to protect the Arctic Refuge. So my interest in this topic was actually sparked many years ago by a photograph. Sorry, let me put this on full screen. There we go. I'll never forget the first time I saw this image. It was the summer of 2005, and I was visiting family in Seattle doing some research at the University of Washington. And one afternoon, as I was about to leave the library, this picture stopped me dead in my tracks. The colors, I'm sure, drew me in. You see the orange land and the luminescent waters that lead to the sky beyond. But then I looked more closely and I could see all of those white birds all throughout the image, flocks of snow geese coalescing as waves and undulations that seemed to flow toward the horizon. I looked at the photograph and it was on a poster, and it mentioned the name of a photographer by the name of Shubhankar Banerjee, and it was advertising his exhibit called Seasons of Life and Land that was on display at the University of Washington campus. Now, I'd never heard of this photographer before, so I rushed to a library computer and I did a quick Google search and learned that his photos had originally been exhibited 2 years earlier at the Smithsonian, where they triggered a major controversy because this was during a time where there was an aggressive push to drill in the Arctic Refuge. So I went over to the show and I found myself mesmerized by his photographs. This is one of pregnant caribou migrating over a frozen river on their way to the Arctic coastal plain, the place where they give birth to a new generation of caribou. I was also interested in how Banerjee focused on how the refuge was interconnected with indigenous communities, including this photograph where you see a Gwich'in man by the name of Charlie Swaney. He's at his hunting camp near Arctic Village, Alaska. I ended up going back to this show a couple more times before I left Seattle. I went back home and I wrote an essay about the exhibit. And at the time, I thought I would never write about the Arctic Refuge again. I spent much of the next decade working on this book called Seeing Green, which looks at iconic images of environmentalism. But something led me back to the Arctic. When I finished this book, I knew that I wanted to approach history differently, to try to write about the history of a particular place. And that's what led me to start to read more again about the Arctic Refuge and the debate over this land. Now, before diving into the story that I tell in the book, I just want to pause for a second to help get us oriented by showing you this map. This is really, I think, one of the most remarkable maps I've ever seen. When you first look at it, it seems like almost any other map. If you look right down the middle, there's a dotted line that shows you the line between the United States and Canada. But ultimately, a story of national borders is not what this map is all about, as I'll explain. So what you're looking at here is a portion of Alaska and then the Yukon and a portion of the Northwest Territories in Canada. The gray shaded area on the left side, on the Alaska side, is the Arctic Refuge. This area was originally set aside in 1960 by executive order by Republican President Dwight Eisenhower, and then doubled in size 20 years later. Now, that 1980 law granted permanent wilderness protection for much of the refuge, but it left the coastal plain, that's the red shaded area at the top, in legislative limbo, meaning that its eventual fate would be decided by Congress, which would have the power to either extend wilderness protection to this coastal plain or to allow oil development there, because there is a belief that there could be a large amount of fossil fuel resources under this land. So since that time, as I'm sure many of you know, the Arctic Refuge has been the focus of the longest running public land debate in US history. Oil companies, the state of Alaska, and powerful politicians have tried to drill in the refuge, have pushed for that, while environmental and indigenous leaders have struggled to protect this ecosystem from fossil fuel development. So the two curvy lines that you see in the map, this is the true story that the map is telling, is in these lines. The darker line shows you the transboundary range of the porcupine caribou herd. This herd of caribou currently numbers over 200,000 animals. So it's a massive herd. And it has its wintering range in the mountains and boreal forests of Alaska and Canada. And then they migrate every spring to the Arctic coastal plain to have their young. And just caribou, many other wildlife species depend on the refuge, including polar bears, which have denning sites there, as well as 200 species of birds that migrate from across North America, all 50 states, and 6 continents around the world, including this buff-breasted sandpiper that comes all the way from Argentina to the northeastern corner of Alaska every year. So in that way, the refuge is important for Alaska and for Canada, but also it's a transnational and global, a place of transnational and global significance for animals all around the world. Finally, this map, which was created by the Gwich'in Steering Committee, which is an advocacy group led by Gwich'in in Alaska and Canada, shows you the striking overlap between the range of the caribou, the porcupine caribou herd, again, that's the darker line, and the traditional homeland of the Gwich'in people. And that's shown by the lighter line. And as you can see, those two lines on this map repeatedly intersect. They almost mirror one another. And that shows us the profound interconnections between indigenous communities and the caribou. So early in the research, as I was trying to understand the history of the debate over this land, I came across an article that I found quite intriguing. It was a piece published in Sierra Magazine, a brief profile of a man by the name of Lenny Comb, a photographer who traveled around the US presenting a slideshow called The Last Great Wilderness. And I thought this was intriguing, that this was the way in which he was trying to galvanize public support for this issue. So I started writing him a letter to see if I could interview him. That was in August of 2014, so almost 7 years ago now. And I put the note aside for a while. I wanted to do a bit more research before I actually contacted him. And I completed the letter in October of 2014. Before hitting send, I Googled his name one more time. I just want to make sure I had the right email address. And the first link to appear was his obituary. He had passed away just a few weeks before, September 25th, 2014 at the age of 74. I was stunned to read this news. And the next day, I ended up talking with a friend of his for almost an hour. And near the end of our conversation, he offhandedly said to me that he was giving the eulogy at Lenny's memorial on Saturday. By the way, he said, if there's any way you can make it down, it would be wonderful to have you here. Now, I wasn't sure how to respond. I didn't know if it'd be appropriate for me to attend because I didn't even know this man. But he understood my concerns and encouraged me to come anyway. He said this wasn't going to be a somber occasion. It was going to be a celebration of his life. And just before saying goodbye, he insisted Lenny would want you to be there. So I decided to go to his memorial held in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. Many people there were from nearby communities like Boone and Blowing Rock, but others had come from elsewhere, including a representative of the Gwich'in Nation all the way from Alaska. You can see here, these are the actual slide projectors he carried with him on his slideshow tours. The room was decorated with some of his treasured possessions like his slide projectors and camera, and also a beaded floral patterned caribou skin vest given to him by indigenous people from the north. Speaking on behalf of the Gwich'in Nation, Lucy Beach said that all of our hearts are heavy for our brother, our uncle, our grandpa. She talked about the deep connections Lenny formed with Gwich'in communities, and she praised his photographs of her people. He saw us as part of the landscape, she said. He also knew how to listen, how to really, really listen. And that's an important theme in the book, a theme of listening and learning. Beach was one of approximately 50 Gwich'in representatives who traveled with him on slideshow tours all over the United States. And she talked about her experiences on the road. He let us be our own spokespeople. He never told us what to say. And then she announced, if it wasn't for Lenny, I think there would be drilling in the Arctic Refuge right now. And at the potluck dinner that followed, several people said the same thing to me. Lenny and his last great wilderness slideshow tours prevented oil drilling from happening in the refuge. I must admit that I felt skeptical at first. Surely they were exaggerating, and who among us has not engaged in hyperbole at a funeral? But the questions gnawed at me. Could these low budget tours really have had that much of a difference in a high profile environmental debate? Could a traveling slideshow have protected the Arctic Refuge? So when I left this memorial in North Carolina, I had no idea that I would spend the next 5 years chasing down sources, talking with people across the continent who had been involved in some way with Lenny's life and activism. For reasons I can't fully explain, I found myself becoming fascinated and ultimately obsessed with this story. It all happened gradually. I would go to libraries and archives and go through boxes and files looking for materials. And whenever I stumbled across a document that referred to the last great wilderness, I could feel my heart rate quicken. This wasn't a very elusive paper trail. There were a few letters here, there was an occasional tour itinerary there. And so I spent hours that sometimes turn into days, not just in libraries and archives, but also in offices and storage rooms of environmental and indigenous organizations. I went to the homes of activists where I looked through files and boxes that were tucked away in garages and basements. I combed through newspapers, especially smaller market local papers, to gather coverage of these slideshow tours. I spoke with Gwich'in representatives who went on tours, with grassroots organizers who helped plan and promote the show, and with staff members of DC-based environmental groups who helped coordinate these tours for many years. I was looking for any clues that could help me understand the life of Lenny Comb and the impact of this show. Now, for a while, these are some tour itineraries here. For a while, I tried to track down a physical copy of the last Great Wilderness show until I began to despair that I might never find one. His massive collection of slides were being kept at a friend's house outside of Boone, North Carolina, but no one knew whether the original slideshow, which had not only slides, but also a soundtrack with music and narration, was still intact and available anywhere. The following summer, I was doing research in Fairbanks, Alaska, and on the far corner of a bookshelf of an environmental group, the Northern Alaska Environmental Center, I spotted a binder that simply said LGW Slideshow. When I opened it up, I found that it was filled with plastic storage sheets containing slides from the show. And what I learned from this was that the Northern Center, this Fairbanks-based organization, had also sponsored people to go on slideshow tours over the years. They had a duplicate copy of the exact same show. I also learned that a local volunteer was planning at some point to digitize the slides, but there were slides missing from this binder, and it was unclear whether anyone in Fairbanks, like anyone in North Carolina, knew whether there was a copy of the music and the narration anywhere. When I turned to the final sheet in this binder, I found a slide listing the credits for the show, and I placed it on a light box. And I took note of the name of Richard Dale, who is credited with producing the soundtrack. I contacted him and was ecstatic to learn not only that he had another copy of the slides, there were only 3 copies of the show ever created, but also that he had digitized the full show, including the soundtrack. When I visited him in California a few months later, he gave me a digital copy of the show I'd been searching for. So I began to piece together this story. I began to realize that the last Great Wilderness Show, which was clearly a source that could easily be lost to history, was also a remarkable experiment in citizen democracy and grassroots activism. We tend to think of images as having the most power when they're seen by the most people. Think about singular iconic pictures like Dorothea Lange's Depression era photograph, Migrant Mother, which I'm sure most of you have seen before, or NASA's blue marble image of the whole Earth. These images are routinely celebrated because they are seen as having the capacity to crystallize a cultural moment, to shape public consciousness, even some would say alter the course of history. These are famous images. Lenny's slideshow was something very different. These photographs never became iconic. This story invites us to consider the impact of images that did not circulate in the mass media, but rather were shared in such unassuming venues, university lecture halls, public libraries, and church basements. So, who was this guy, Lenny Comb? Here he is with his fire engine red long johns in the Arctic and floppy blue hat. He was a very unlikely activist. He graduated from the Berklee College of Music and then pursued a career as a jazz drummer for 15 years. In 1977, he decided that he was probably, quote, the 238th best drummer in the world. I really like that tongue-in-cheek quantitative precision, the 238th best drummer. He decided to abandon his percussion career and he moved to Sonoma, California. He walked into a drugstore and, as he put it, conned my way into running the photo department. So he was the guy that would develop a film that customers dropped off. And he said that that's what partly sparked his interest in photography. In fact, he soon took up photography himself and began dabbling in photojournalism. In 1987, when he was 47 years old, the Reagan administration was pushing to develop the Arctic Refuge, and Lenny journeyed north. He was on a speculative assignment for Audubon magazine. He visited the Arctic Refuge because he wanted to sell pictures to the magazine. That was his primary reason for going up there. But he also had the opportunity to visit two indigenous communities, Arctic Village, Alaska, and Old Crow, Yukon, both of which were on that map that I showed at the beginning. From the Gwich'in, he gained an entirely different perspective on the Arctic Refuge debate. He learned from them that the drilling plan represented a form of colonial violence that threatened their culture and the caribou that migrate through their lands. He learned that the place where the caribou give birth was the exact place where the fossil fuel industry sought to drill, and that this development would jeopardize the culture and the identity and the food security of indigenous peoples on both sides of the US-Canada border. This experience changed his life. He went back to California. He immediately threw himself into anti-drilling activism, forming a small group called the Sonoma Coalition for the Arctic Refuge. And this began as a small local grassroots effort to convince their congressional representative to vote against oil drilling. So it's a very modest kind of thing. Can we band together as citizens of our community and convince our congressional representative? And from there, it evolved into the last Great Wilderness Project, a multimedia slideshow that became their main outreach tool. In this research, I found a phrase that I think really encapsulates the political vision that underlies these tours. And the phrase that was used was the trickle up theory of politics. So, according to this idea, activists sought to bring local grassroots attention to the Arctic Refuge in communities across the US. And in turn, they believed that local media coverage and citizen concern would trickle up to the national media outlets and to policymakers in DC. So they're trying to change what's going on in Capitol Hill. They're trying to change federal policy, but they believe the way to do so is through the involvement of people across the United States. They believe that that's where the true source of power lies, is outside the Beltway. And so this trickle up theory, I think, really captures the approach taken by Lenny and the Sonoma Coalition, which again started off as an effort to influence one member of Congress and then turned into something much more. The coalition was also significant because they reframed the ideas and images of the Arctic Refuge, connecting this place that's far away to many of us seems very remote, but they made it seem much closer to people's lives and also to the cultural survival and food security of Indigenous people in the North. Before this little group in Sonoma came along, national environmental groups rarely emphasized the human rights issues at stake, let alone partnered with the Gwich'in in their refuge campaigns. The Sonoma Coalition helped change that and helped turn this into a fight for environmental justice. In 1988, a year after his first trip up north, Lenny went back to the Arctic, maybe wearing his red long johns again, and he spent 4 months in Gwich'in communities in Alaska, the Yukon, and the Northwest Territories. He was there to take photographs for the show and also to learn from the Gwich'in about their lives on the land. Norma Cassie, a leader of the Vuntut Gwich'in First Nation in Canada, said he wanted to connect with the Indigenous peoples and grasp our stories. He went right directly to our camps. He lived with us on the land. He ate caribou with us. He helped us make dry meat. He wanted to feel that, she said. He embraced our Indigenous knowledge as much as he could. So by the time he came back in 1988, Lenny had built trust and understanding with community members. They viewed him as an ally. They believed that his photographs would aid in their struggle to protect the caribou calving grounds in the Arctic Refuge. So he began this 4 month journey through Gwich'in country in Crow Flats, which is a vast wetland area north of Old Crow, Yukon, where he stayed with Norma Cassie and her family at their hunting camp. He took pictures of a snow-covered mountain across Zelma Lake, glimmering in the pale light. He saw a caribou crossing over the still frozen lake. He also took a picture of the campsite where you can see the large canvas wall tent where Norma's family slept and the smaller recreational tent he pitched nearby. These experiences with Norma's family and with other Gwich'in allowed him to learn transnationalism on the ground by glimpsing local realities, by seeing firsthand how Gwich'in in Canada and Alaska were tied to the transboundary caribou herd. While there, Norma Cassie's mother started calling Lenny in Gwich'in the little white man who never sleeps. It was an apt description, Norma told me, because he always seemed to be roaming around, relishing the long hours of sunlight, taking rolls and rolls of pictures. As he wandered around in the bush, her mom teased him. Bear might kill you. She used to talk to him like that, Norma recalled. And he'd look at me funny, and we'd bust out laughing. Finally, I told her in Gwich'in, we need those pictures because we're going to show it to everybody outside in the world. Lenny made these photographs in cooperation with Indigenous communities. He hoped that they would play a role in helping the Gwich'in fight for a future of their own. When Lenny returned to California after 4 months up north in the fall of 1988, he and other Sonoma Coalition members put together the slideshow. They began by gathering pictures from everyone they knew, many different Arctic photographers, a few thousand images in all, and they gradually winnowed that down to 250 images to include. Several were taken by Wilbur Mills, who had visited what was then called the Arctic Range in the late 60s and 70s. There were also shots taken by U.S. Fish and Wild Service scientists such as Fran Maurer, including this shot of an incredible aggregation of caribou, and also photos of the Prudhoe Bay oil fields by Pamela A. Miller. And about 80 photos in the show were taken by Lenny Comb of Gwich'in communities. They adopted what they considered in the Sonoma Coalition at the time to be cutting edge technology. They took 2 slide projectors along with something called a fade dissolve unit, and that was cued to a soundtrack. And so what would happen is when you're watching the show, and I'm going to show you a couple scenes here in a moment, is that there's the viewers would be able to see one slide gradually fade out as the slide from the other projector gradually fades in. So there's this moment where the images are sort of superimposed on one another, like they're layered on top of one another, as you'll see. So the show runs for about 30 minutes. And as I said, I now have a digitized version of it. So I want to share with you what this experience would have been like. And Richard Dale, who digitized the show, tried to replicate that original experience of the fade dissolve unit. So I'm going to show you a couple clips, beginning first with the beginning of the show, the first couple minutes. And it's going to open with complete darkness. This long period of darkness is going to make the beginning of the show seem like the beginning of the world. So you're just going to hear music for about 30 seconds in darkness, and then the slides will begin right after the singer mentions light.
But if I close my eyes, I can ride the winds. I can coast the earth, rest ashore, and rise again. But I won't close my eyes till it's time, my friend, till your weary smile starts to light, so light begins.
So I hope you were able to appreciate, how all of these slides and music work together. Later, a narrator begins to explain what's going on with the issue. So the show includes a lot of images of wildlife, trying to stress the value of wildlife protection and the value of wild places. It also discusses fossil fuel dependency and the threats that oil development poses to the North Slope of Alaska. And this is 1988, but they were already in this slideshow talking a bit about global warming and the need to transition to a more sustainable energy system. And after that, later in the show, they turned to Gwich'in country to present the refuge struggle as a fight for Indigenous rights and environmental justice. And again, this is with photos by Lenny Comb. So I want to show you a second clip now. And in this clip, you're going to see Lenny's photos from the communities and also primarily hear the voices of Randall and Mabel Tetlichi, 2 members of the Vuntut Gwich'in Nation in Old Crow, Yukon, who Lenny interviews for the show.
It seems to me that the time has come to listen to the wisdom of these people who have been stewards of the land for thousands of years.
Lenny, we want to be heard. We want the whole world to know we do exist.
What would you tell them?
I'll tell them we live north of the Arctic Circle and we've been living off the land for centuries. And that we depend on the porcupine caribou herd every day of our lives. I mean, I did since I was born, and my grandparents and grandparents, only God knows how many grandparents before me depend on it. And now I want to see my grandchildren depend on it. I mean, we make use of everything on the caribou, right from the hoofs right to the horn. We make games out of it, we make different medicine out of it, we eat it, we make clothes with it, we make tools with it. You know, that's our survival. If there's no caribou, we're gonna have a hard time with it. And I hope people from the south listen to us and try to get the picture that we talk about. Well, the Creator made the land for everybody, all the races. And what Native people do is try to respect that, try to respect the Creator. And a lot of old people say, well, material things won't help you. The spiritual side of life, and learning how to be kind and having respect and patience and good reason for all your movements without hurting anybody is very important.
Me as an individual, I have respect for the land as a Native person. I have respect for everywhere I go. We're just people that live off the land, and we could teach people lots. I feel we could teach people lots.
Oops,
It
sorry.
seems to me that the time is.
So that one of those lines that Randall Tetlichi says, I hope people from the South listen to us and get the picture we talk about, that really becomes crucial to this entire slideshow project, because it became about encouraging people in the South, in the United States, to listen to the voices of the Gwich'in and to think about this issue in terms of a story of environmental justice. In the slideshow itself, and also because so many Gwich'in went on the road with Lenny to share their stories with audiences. The show ends with a photograph of two pairs of boys, their arms draped around one another. You can see them beaming with this irrepressible glee as they run down a road in Old Crow. And that dissolves into the final slide, a photograph of caribou migrating, two clusters of bulls walking over the ice. Together, these slides fuse the human story with the caribou story, the fate of the Gwich'in with the fate of the Arctic Refuge. Now, for Gwich'in spokespeople, some of Lenny's photographs would hold profound personal meaning, especially when they saw their loved ones in the pictures. Lorraine Nitro described to me what she remembers when she first saw this photograph. It was 1999, she said, the first time I ever gave a talk with Lenny. And there were 300 to 500 people there, and I didn't know what to expect. I'm trying to be brave and strong and thinking in my head, how is I going to go about it? Then she said, I saw a picture of my son and his friends. They were happy. They had their arms around each other. They had teeth missing and just were smiling. By the time it was my time to speak, I just felt there was a reason I was there. One day, she said, I hope to be blessed with grandchildren. I'm doing this because it's my responsibility that they can continue to have our way of life. The very way of life for my people is in your hands, in your decision makers' hands. So the last Great Wilderness Show fostered a sense of responsibility to those in the photographs, but not as objects of pity, as active participants in this struggle. We're not asking for pity, Norma Cassie told an audience in 1995. We seek understanding and acceptance for our knowledge of what we can share. We need to be listened to. We need to be partners in all decision making for our future, because they will never get rid of us. We'll always be here. In the summer of 2016, I showed the Gwich'in segment of the show to Norma. She hadn't seen the slideshow in 20 years and was excited to look at the pictures again. As the images flashed across my laptop screen, she mentioned the names of people she recognized, including her sister. When I asked her what she thought of Lenny's photos, it didn't take her long to respond. It was, I think for me, an intelligent approach, she said, to embrace how important the people were and how connected we are to the caribou. He was very much part of us. He listened and he engaged in a very respectful way. She said that many other photographers had visited Old Crow before, but Norma believed that Lenny's work was distinctive. That was the first portrayal of the Gwich'in, how intricate our way of life was and is as Arctic peoples. Many Gwich'in I interviewed emphasized how important Lenny was to building trust and alliances. Faith Gimmel, an Alaskan Gwich'in, recalled how she felt the first time she saw the slideshow in DC. When I first saw the show, I was crying. I was so homesick for my own people. Just seeing them on the screen and hearing their voice, I started crying because I was so homesick. And he knew it. So he came right up to me after, and we just hung out. And he just made me laugh, made me feel better, you know? He was like that. Not all the greenies were like Lenny, she said. He made me feel comfortable. He saw me as a human being, not as this exotic indigenous person from the north. He treated me like that, and he made me comfortable right away. We were close from then on. Faith emphasized the challenges of alliance building. She recalled an advice a Gwich'in elder once gave to her. Speaking about environmentalists, he said, "We'll work with them. We'll have respect for each other. But in the ultimate end, we might end up standing alone." So I always remember that, she said, because they're not invested. They don't live here. It's not their children that will be impacted. So for them, they could walk away tomorrow, jump on some other issue, and leave us hanging. Faith said that Lenny was one of the key environmentalists who helped build strong ties with the Gwich'in. And that's why he was important, because people like him were a linchpin. They kept us connected. She also wanted me to appreciate the diversity of Gwich'in who went on the road with Lenny. He traveled with elders. He traveled with youth. He traveled with women, she said. We have to trust whoever is with him that they're going to take good care of them. We've sent cherished elders, cherished young people to him from our villages because we trusted him. In the early years, Lenny drove this car right here, a metallic green Chevy Malibu Classic, around the country, which had bumper stickers announcing the tour's purpose: help preserve the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, America's last great wilderness. He would fill the back seat with everything he needed for the show: slide projectors and carousel trays, sound system and speakers, and cables, wires, and cords. And he carried the equipment in those two boxes right there, custom built wooden crates. One of them had wheels, so he could stack the hefty boxes on top of one another and roll everything to the next show. And that's Lenny there with Glenna Frost, who toured with him in 1991 from Old Crow, Yukon. So just as environmental groups came to see the last great wilderness as critical to the Arctic campaign, so too did Indigenous leaders in the North. Across northwestern Canada and northeastern Alaska, Gwich'in governments and other organizations worked closely with Lenny to ensure Indigenous participation. One of these representatives was Glenna Frost, who toured through the Midwest in 1991, just before the US Senate was planning to vote on an energy bill that included an Arctic drilling provision. This was a bill that many thought seemed destined for passage. Glenna Frost was born and raised in Old Crow, and she recalled feeling uncertain about whether she'd be able to travel around the US with someone she had never met before and speak in front of audiences who probably didn't know anything about her culture. But her family and community members encouraged her. They said by joining Lenny, she could help the Gwich'in people. She felt many challenges on the road. She was on the road for almost 7 weeks with Lenny, but she felt that the tour also helped her feel more connected with her community and with our ancestors that have passed on. She recalled feeling that it's not about me, it's about our life, about our culture, and the caribou that we have relied on for thousands of years. When Glenna and Lenny visited Carbondale, Illinois, they were hosted by local Sierra Club volunteers, Laurel Toussaint and Tom Bick. After she finished speaking at Southern Illinois University, Tom remembered seeing tears on the face of many audience members. It was an amazing thing, he said. You invite people to a show and they're sitting there in a chair weeping. There was a kind of transformative nature to the night. some close emotional connections get made. After the, the slideshow presentation, Laurel wrote a long letter to the local newspaper talking about the profound impact of their visit. Glenna Frost's message moved hundreds of Southern Illinoisans, she said. For many of us, hearing her speak expanded the Arctic issue to include the native people of the region. Saving the Arctic from oil drilling is a human rights issue. So in this way, the slideshow helped change audiences' views of this place and made deepen many of their commitment to the cause. On November 1st, 1991, much to the surprise of many observers, the Senate voted to scuttle this energy bill that would have allowed for Arctic drilling. And many credited grassroots involvement, including these slideshow tours, with making all the difference. So in the book, I discuss other tense moments, times when it seemed the outcome could go either way, and much of the narrative hinges on these kinds of moments, on what we could really think of as a relatively narrow time scale of recent American political history. But I also try to include some longer term perspective. As an outsider, I will never be able to understand the depth of feeling and concern that Gwich'in bring to the Arctic Refuge fight, relations of responsibility that they have maintained with the caribou since time immemorial. Shirley Frost, a citizen of the Vuntut Gwich'in First Nation who toured with Lenny, explained to me that whenever she spoke about the refuge, she tried to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves, for young people, for future generations, for non-human beings. What gave her strength, she said, was knowing that there were thousands of years of ancestors sitting behind me and speaking through me. She was addressing and inhabiting the present moment, but that moment contained multitudes of time, the countless generations behind her, the future generations before her, and the generations of caribou and other life forms that depend on Arctic ecosystems. So all of these timescales were collapsed and compressed into her words and in the collective Gwich'in effort to maintain their pact with the caribou, to keep alive these relations of responsibility that run the full sweep of Gwich'in time. So as I pieced together the story of this slideshow, I also found it offered a portal into many other themes. I just want to mention a few of those before I move into the close of the talk. So in the book, I've woven histories of indigenous resistance to colonial mega projects in Alaska and Canada, of the government suppression of science, of changing political dynamics in DC, of the role of the Gwich'in Steering Committee in building alliances with diverse groups, including faith communities. And this is an important part of the story, that churches and people of faith have been involved in the refuge struggle since the late 1980s, largely because of the human rights issues at stake, because they came to see it as more than a question of wilderness versus oil, because they understood it as a fight for environmental justice. And I refer to religious groups as forming part of a larger coalition of conscience that has participated in this struggle for many decades. I also look at the work of other photographers and filmmakers who've used images as tools for public outreach, including the photographs of Shubhankar Banerjee that I showed you earlier, and the documentary film Being Caribou. Since attending Lenny's memorial back in 2014, I've interviewed many people who have stated without any doubt or hesitation that his slideshow protected the Arctic Refuge. Joe Tetlichi, a Gwich'in representative from Canada who joined Lenny on 2 slideshow tours, said, if it wasn't for him, there would be oil development in the Arctic Refuge right now. You think so, I asked. Oh yeah, he immediately responded. I don't think so. I know so. Look at the close calls we had. Imagine if Lenny never went up for the job. What could have happened? Brian O'Donnell, who served as the executive director of the DC-based Alaska Wilderness League for several years, said that Lenny's project kept the Arctic Refuge from being destroyed. Absolutely. Now, it'd be easy to dismiss these comments as naive statements regarding the power of images or in one individual to influence environmental policy. But I don't think they are claiming that the slideshow had some kind of simple, direct, or immediate effect on politics. Beyond the sheer number of constituent letters and phone calls generated by these tours, beyond the particular elected officials whose positions shifted due to citizen pressure, this project created a set of relationships reaching from Capitol Hill to north of the Arctic Circle to cities and towns across the lower 48. And it's these relationships that allow the slideshow to have agency, to have impact on the world. As Brian said, how did the Arctic Refuge go from being a wildlife refuge to being an iconic place that was the biggest environmental fight in the US for decades? It's never that one meeting in a garden club in Toledo, Ohio, but maybe it's the 1,000 meetings and the 1,000 Toledos around the country. And you can never know which one did it or how this all happened. But I can tell you that it wouldn't have happened without Lenny. Brian noted how the slideshow tours had short-term effects, blast of grassroots enthusiasm, from letters and phone calls before votes, but also long-term reverberations, building a larger base of support, people who remained involved in this cause for years to come. And as Joe and others emphasized, Lenny played a crucial role in forming relationships and building trust between Gwich'in communities and environmental organizations. And Joe's use of counterfactuals, imagine if Lenny never went up for the job, what could have happened, suggests that at various moments, different outcomes could have occurred. I first met Joe in the summer of 2016, which was the 8th year of Barack Obama's presidency. The Arctic Refuge had been in political dormancy for about a decade. The last major standoff occurred during the George W. Bush administration. A few months after we talked, Donald Trump was elected president. Spewing climate change denial, his administration immediately launched an all-out assault on environmental regulation and push for the reckless expansion of fossil fuel development. And it took little time for political leaders to sneak an Arctic drilling provision into the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, which was passed by Congress and signed by Trump on December 22nd, 2017. And this, in a long history of the Arctic Refuge debate, was the first time that both Congress and the president had approved a drilling plan. And I can talk more about the current politics of this during the Q&A period if you'd like. With the refuge debate, the refuge under greater threat than ever before, I think that this history has a new relevance and urgency for our time. Now, the stories that I've shared with you here don't offer a blueprint to follow today. It's hard to imagine someone loading up a car with slide projectors and driving around the country, but they demonstrate how visual images, along with testimony from people in frontline communities, can help mobilize and organize at the grassroots. They show how respectful relationships and alliances can be built between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. And they show how this place, this Arctic landscape, is connected ecologically to places across the continent and around the world. This book offers a history of contingency. It's a story of things that could have turned out differently. It's a history forged not only in the hard marble hallways of Capitol Hill or the pages of the New York Times, but a history made by a rambling activist, Gwich'in spokespeople, and local organizers. It's a history enacted in lecture halls and church basements and public libraries. So the story that I try to tell in this book is one of the grassroots taking on Goliath, of a slideshow galvanizing the citizenry, and of unlikely cross-cultural alliances forming across vast distances. I wrote this book very much with the feeling that I was writing during an urgent time, but I've tried to infuse it with hope that things might still turn out differently.